Good morning, and welcome to today's forum in the beautiful weather of Washington, D.C. We'll be highlighting some recently released IES related to effective teaching. My name is Betsy Warner, and I'm responsible for developing the teacher evaluation agenda at the National Center for Education Evaluation at IES. I'm really excited about this opportunity today to discuss from two evaluations. Both of these reports are pretty complicated, and I think we can offer some plain talk today about this important work. And if we can do that, I think this session will be a success. The first report is part of an emerging literature that uses value-added measures to look at the distribution of effective teaching. The unique contribution of this piece is the geographical coverage and sheer number of districts that are included in this study. The study is ongoing, so I'm interested in the discussion both in terms of reactions thus far to the work, as well as comments about what analyses we might find useful going forward. The second is a report from a completed random assignment study. Today, authors for both reports will provide an overview of their studies with an emphasis on informing the following two major issues. What evidence do we have about whether disadvantaged students have equal access to effective teaching in reading and math? Granted, this work is based solely on value-added measures. However, student achievement growth is an important element of performance measures supported by current policy. The second issue addresses a potential strategy of offering bonuses to promote effective teachers teaching where they are needed most. This is just one of several strategies one might promote, but it has a number of broader potential implications about value-added and pay incentives that I think will be very interesting to discuss. So I'm pleased to introduce each of our distinguished panelists and direct you to today's forum materials to learn more about each of them. But briefly, Eric Eisenberg will be presenting first. He is a senior researcher at Mathematica Policy Research, and he is the principal investigator on the first study we will discuss. Steve Glazerman is a senior fellow at Mathematica. He led the impact evaluation of the study involving transfer incentives. We are also honored and distinguished to have two guests that will offer comments and insights on the reports. Jonathan Raymond is superintendent of Sacramento City Unified School District, California's 12th largest school district. I'm looking forward to his comments on this type of research and the findings, offering the perspective from the field. Andrew Rotherham is co-founder and partner at Bellwether Education Partners, a national nonprofit organization working to support educational innovation and improve academic outcomes for low-income students. I'm looking forward to his thoughts on the findings and their potential implications for policy and practice. Our plan for today is to have each of the study authors take about 10 minutes to just provide a brief overview of the studies. And then we'll have each of the discussants take 10 to 15 minutes to offer comments on these studies. And then we'll take questions from our audience, whether that be through a webinar or in-house. A few housekeeping items. Our session today includes both an in-person and an online audience. Please note that we are video recording today's session and may capture images of some of you in the audience. This video will be posted on NPR's website later in the week to help ensure the highest possible sound quality for our webinar participants. We ask that you silence all your electronic devices. Now I'm going to turn over the podium to Eric Eisenberg to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. So I'll be talking about, as Betsy said, the first study, which is on access to effective teaching for disadvantaged students. Pleased also to have two of my co-authors, Phil Gleason and Jeffrey Max, also here in the room. So First, in terms of the overall research questions, as Betsy mentioned, this is an ongoing study. We're primarily looking at two research questions. First of all, to what extent do disadvantaged students have equal access to effective teaching within school districts? And then the second question is that access to effective teaching related to different patterns of teacher hiring, mobility, and attrition for high and low poverty schools? It is really the first question that is the focus of the first completed study that we'll be talking about today. We're currently working on a follow-up brief that will address the second question on teacher mobility patterns, and then we will be writing a final report out in a couple of years that looks at both of these questions and extends our data for another 2 years. So our sample that we're looking at is really a diverse set of districts. One of the things that makes our study a little different from the prior literature is that the prior literature had mostly focused on a more restricted set of districts. One study looked at 10. We intentionally, purposefully sampled from districts around the country, and our sample includes 29 districts from 16 states. We have districts from all of the 4 U.S. Census regions and at least 4 districts from each U.S. Census region. Our districts are mostly located in medium-sized to large cities, although there are some districts that are predominantly rural as well. In terms of what these districts look like, they look similar to the 100 largest districts in the country. In terms of size, they range from about 20,000 students to over 100,000 students, and they contain more low-income and minority students than is the case of the typical U.S. district. It looks more sort of like those 100 largest districts in the country on those kind of characteristics. We went to our study districts and we gathered from them data on instructors and students for English language, arts, and math in grades 4 to 8, collecting test score data, collecting data on student characteristics, like does the student have an IEP, and the links of which teachers are teaching which students. And we did this for the most part, 3 years, from the 2008-2009 school year to the 2010-2011 school year. So then how do we measure access to effective teaching? Well, we use 4 steps. The first step was to use a value-added analysis to measure effective teaching. So what this means is that we were looking to isolate the contribution of a teacher's effect on student achievement apart from what the students themselves bring to the table. So to do this, we looked at students' achievement on an end-of-year test score at the end of the year that they spent with the teacher, and used a statistical model to capture how much of that was due to the teacher they had, as well as to the student's achievement on a baseline test score and other student characteristics. So, for example, if the student had an IEP, we specifically accounted for how much that was related to student achievement, in order that we were then measuring really a teacher's contribution to student achievement and not just attributing to teachers being effective teachers because they tended to teach kids that were prone to have high test scores. So in other words, when measuring effective teaching, what we were looking at was how did a teacher do with their kids relative to other teachers who taught a similar mix of students. A measure of effective teaching for every teacher, that was step 1. Step 2 then was to link each student to the value added of their teacher. So whether that teacher was somewhere above average, whether that teacher was around average, or whether that teacher was below average, we linked students to that value added estimate. The third step then was to divide the students between disadvantaged students and students who are not disadvantaged. So we used eligibility for a free or reduced price lunch as our measure of student disadvantage. So to be eligible for a free or reduced price lunch, you have to come from a household that is no more than 185% of the poverty line. I believe works out to about $44,000 for a family of 4. So we have one set of kids in that group, and the other set of kids not eligible, coming from households with higher levels of income. The fourth step then was to compare the average value added for the kids in the one group to the average value added measuring teacher effectiveness for the kids in the other. So in other words, if we pick up a student from the free lunch group and look at the effectiveness of their teacher, pick up a student from the non-free lunch group, look at the effectiveness of their teacher, compare that difference, That's the difference that we're getting, what we sometimes in the report call the effective teaching gap, measuring access to effective teaching. The way that we are structuring it, if that is positive, that says that the teachers of the non-free lunch students are doing better than the teachers of the free lunch students. If that is 0, that means teachers are about equally effective across both groups. And if it's negative, it means that the non-free lunch kids are actually receiving, or the free lunch kids are actually receiving better teaching than the non-free lunch kids. This is sort of a numerical example. I'm going to skip that because I want to get on to talking about the results. So what we find is looking at our 29 districts across the 3 years of the study and the 5 grades that we include, and averaging that together, that we do see that on average there is inequitable access to effective teaching. The teachers that kids receive favor the non-disadvantaged group over the disadvantaged group. So here you see the estimates of standard deviations of student achievement. In English language arts, we found that the difference on average was 0.034 standard deviations of student achievement. For math, the average 0.024 standard deviations of student achievement. So this is, again, these bars showing, because they're positive, that this is favoring the non-free lunch group. Now, how big are these estimates? One way to gauge it is to look at how this would change the student achievement gap. So what you see here is, on average for our district, what is just the gap in student achievement between free and reduced price lunch eligible students and students not eligible. What you see here for English language arts is that the average student not free lunch eligible is at the 68th percentile of achievement among students, and the average free lunch eligible student is at the 40th percentile. And there are similar differences for math. Now, if we were to have had equal access to effective teaching instead of this, how would these change? They would change by 2 percentile points. So now what we've seen is that in English language arts, at the end of 1 year, the non-free lunch students would be at the 67th percentile, free lunch students at the 41st percentile. So again, here's the actual percentiles. Here's what we would have had with equal access to effective teaching. So just a slight change corresponding to the 0.034 and the 0.024 that we saw before. Across our districts. So this is 29 bars, each one representing one of our study districts. Each bar here is a district, and what you're seeing is this measure of access to effective teaching. Here's the average, the 0.034 that you saw before for English language arts. And when you see the solid bars, these are the districts where you had differences that were statistically significantly different from 0. So here's where we have evidence for less effective teaching. The 2 districts that we put over on the left, these we say are approximately equal because they're not at least statistically different from 0. So in addition to saying that most of the districts have statistical differences, you have to see a range among those districts. Well, there is a pretty deep size group somewhere around this average of 0.04. You do have 3 districts up here that the difference is greater than 0.06 in terms of, again, standard deviations of student achievement. For math, story a little bit more equitable. Again, the average difference is lower. 19 of the districts, we have evidence for less effective teaching based on statistical significance. 10 districts, approximately equal. Difference is not statistically different from 0. But again, you have 3 districts up here with differences that are much more inequitable even than the average. Final thing that we did was to look at how these differences break out as far as being differences attributable to between school differences versus within school differences. What I mean by that is how much of these gaps that we measure are due to the placement of teachers and students across schools. And this could be responsive to a number of policies, including the way that teachers are brought into the district, that rules for which teachers can transfer between schools, that could be affecting these between school differences. The other that are within school differences based on the way that principals assign teachers to students within schools. This could, say, result from a tracking policy, say, within a middle school. So we break it out. The result here is that this is, again, the 0.024 and 0.024 we saw before, but we have here the students part, which is the within school part. as you can see from the figures, most of the difference actually is also adds a statistically significant amount to the total total amount of this gap. And the between school part is especially important for English language arts. So again, just to review, we do document that disadvantaged students do receive less effective teaching on average. We see that equal access in 1 year would reduce the student achievement gap by 2 percentile points in English language arts and in math. We see that access to effective teaching varied across the districts that were in our study. And we see that the differences are more related to the way that teachers and students are placed across schools than to the way that principals match teachers and students within schools. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to talk about the next study.
Thanks, Eric. So I'm happy to be here today presenting findings from our study that we released last month. This is something of Victory Lab, so I want to make sure to acknowledge not just my co-authors, Ali, Ingru, Julie, and Jeffrey, but also a large group of folks at Mathematica, at Optimal Solutions Group who helped with the evaluation and data collection, but also importantly, the folks who implemented the intervention that we studied, which includes the New Teacher Project, the NTP, as well as a large number, of course, of teachers and principals and central office staff in the districts that agreed to participate in the study. And it's just a shame we can't thank all of them individually. So let me just proceed with a summary of the study and what we found so we can move on to discussing its implications. I think the study that Eric just presented motivates pretty well this concern that maybe the highest performing teachers are not necessarily working with the students who need their skills the most. So one way to address this problem, policymakers want to know if it's even possible to identify high-performing teachers and offer them a bonus to get them to transfer into the low-performing schools. Then if that works, the central question for our study was, would these teachers that were identified as high-performing actually raise their students' test scores in their new schools? And another important question that really nobody knew the answer to was, would they just collect their bonus and leave, or would they stay in these low-performing schools? To answer these and a host of related questions I'm about to describe. So we studied the implementation and impact of a selective transfer incentive intervention that came to be known in the districts as the Talent Transfer Initiative, or TTI. It was implemented in 10 large, economically diverse school districts in 7 states. It focused on those who were teaching reading and math in grades 3 through 8. We actually focused on 3 pools of teachers. So there's elementary school, multiple subject teachers, middle school math teachers, and middle school English language arts teachers. And the way TTI worked was that each district's highest performing teachers within those pools I just mentioned, typically the top 20% within each pool, some dollars if they would be willing to transfer into one of the low-performing schools that we selected for the study. Teachers were already in those schools, so they were high-performing, but they were already in a low-performing school, were offered $10,000 over 2 years. All they had to do was stay in their schools. So we took these teachers. Oops, this is moving by itself. Wait 1 second, I'm just going to turn something off. Okay. So we took these teachers into account, the ones who were already teaching in the low-performing schools, but they were not the focus of the study. The focus was on the transfers. So the way that high-performing teachers were identified, in case you're wondering, was using value-added analysis, something that Eric just talked about. And that's it was based typically on 3 years of data. Teachers were ranked within their pool by their estimated impact on their students' achievement growth, so adjusting for the type of students that they work with. So now I'm going to show you this in pictures, okay? So imagine you have a school district with of high-performing schools and schools where test scores are chronically low. Highest performing and offered them $20,000 if they transferred to one of the openings that a TNTP site manager was going to tell them about in one of these low-performing schools. And at the same time, we identified all the low-performing schools, teaching vacancies and the targeted grades and subjects, and assigned them to either a treatment group that had, where the principal had access to this incentivized pool of high-performing teachers, or a control group where they would. And so TNTP set up interviews surveys, collected test score data, teacher rosters over the next 2 years. And, if we're getting into the impacts to this incentive. So this graph shows the take-up rate, the different stages of. We started out with over 1,500 transfer candidates to fill 92 positions, and less than a third of the candidates showed up to an information session. 22% filled out a brief online application, 12% interviewed, and 5% ultimately transferred. This may seem like fairly low take-up. A lot of people didn't participate in elementary school, and there are the numbers for the middle school math and ELA, respectively. But these numbers were enough to fill almost all of the vacancies, almost 9 out of 10 of the vacancies. The report has a whole lot more description of implementation, including, okay, well, what are the types of people who didn't transfer, and since who did, and who filled these vacancies, where did they transfer from? How did the policy change the dynamics within the receiving opportunity to hire a high-performing teacher, and so on and so on. But I'm going to focus next on the impacts that teachers had on their students' test scores once they transferred. So we found that GTI had positive and statistically significant impacts on student test scores, with the effect coming from elementary schools. The impact in elementary schools the impacts were 18 and 10% of the standard deviation in math and reading, respectively, year after the transfer. In the second year, the impacts were 22 and 25% of the standard deviation. So these impacts are the equivalent of raising an average from by about 4 to 10 percentile points. Okay, so while TTI raised test scores in elementary schools, it did not in the middle schools in our sample. The corresponding results here show statistically insignificant or even negative impacts. So there's a lot more to say about these uneven findings. In a few minutes, I'll talk about the overall picture. But first, let me just summarize some of the impacts on teacher retention. Wrong direction. So bottom line is that, in general, teachers in the TTI transfer group didn't run. We get 23 percentage point difference in retention after the first year. Payments were being made to the teachers. Remember, the $20,000 was paid out in installments. So what we did is we checked had ended. And the difference between the teachers in the TTI group and their control group counterparts were not statistically significant. But it's still somewhat interesting to note that 60% of those teachers were still in their designated low. So, I talked about these impacts on test scores and in terms of percentages of a standard deviation and how they varied by subject and year and grade span. So, to help people understand how large these impacts really are, and to tie everything together, we did a cost-effectiveness calculation. We asked, how much would the district have to spend to generate the same impact through a different program? We used class size reduction as a point of comparison. So what we found was that under most scenarios, TTI was a cheaper option. We estimate the cost savings could be, and this is looking at including both elementary and middle school, so it's really all of our results combined, that the cost savings could be more than $7,000 per teaching team, per grade within a school or grade subject within a middle school. And the cost savings, if we just focus on elementary schools where the impacts are concentrated, the cost savings could be more than $13,000 per elementary team. And this is just looking at the first 2 years over which we observed. But as I noted, since the teachers were still there, there's a likelihood that benefits could extend beyond those 2 years, in which case the cost savings would be even greater. So just to summarize, tying together what I just said, we found that among other implementation findings, the take-up rates were low, but the placement rate was still high enough to fill almost 9 out of 10 program vacancies. As I mentioned, TTI had positive impacts on test scores in elementary schools, but not middle schools. And although I didn't have a chance to mention this earlier in my presentation, these impacts vary more by district than we would have expected just from sampling variation. And this is meaningful because I should point out that the districts in our study varied among themselves in terms of the degree to which they offered TTI at elementary versus middle, some were elementary only, middle only, or some mix. And so these things are sort of grade span and district are somewhat confounded, so it's an important caveat. Also, teachers retained in their positions at higher rates while payments were being made, possibly not too surprising. And after the payouts, while the differences were no longer statistically significant, a majority of teachers, of the transfer teachers, were still there. So under most scenarios, high-performing teachers to transfer is more cost-effective than reducing class size would have been, according to our calculations. Look forward to hearing what the discussants have to say in the audience.
Good morning again. It's nice to be in the snow. It's a novelty in California. But I would say these findings are not a novelty. And these are things that I think we have recognized in the field for quite some time. And it's nice to be able to have now quantitative data that underscores what we have seen, which is a great difference in access to effective teachers for our disadvantaged students. What we've struggled with for a long time is, first of all, how do we measure effectiveness? And it's nice to be able to now be able to have models that have been able to put some data. Although I would say it's quantitative data, and I think one of the things that we often struggle with is the qualitative piece, because there are more things to measure than simply the test scores, particularly when it comes to working in schools with a large majority of disadvantaged children. In Sacramento, just for some context, we have 22 schools that are 100% poverty. So, and we've known for some time that the struggle, particularly as we've been in California in a very downward cycle and having to lay off teachers year after year after year, we struggle with keeping our most effective teachers, who often sometimes lack seniority. So those issues come into play as well. But the important point to know is it is very real. And it has been very difficult to not only keep our most talented teachers once we've been able to identify them, but to be able to then keep them in our schools that are filled with our disadvantaged children. So that's an important point to know. The other point that I think came out in the study was that how long it takes, right? So, you saw some data which indicated after 1 year, if there was equal access to effective teachers, that there would be some movement and closure in that achievement gap. But by my short calculations, if we stayed on that trajectory, it takes about 12 years. So think about that time factor. So, I would argue that it isn't just equal access, but it's giving our disadvantaged children not only greater access, but perhaps having our most and our highest effective teachers in our lowest performing schools with access to our disadvantaged children. So how do we accelerate that and close those gaps in real, meaningful ways? It also raises question, where do we put our most talented teachers? Do we spread them across our elementary grades? As we've learned, there wasn't great significance with our middle schools when we talk about the incentive program. So, it really begs the question: do we concentrate our most effective teachers at the earliest grade levels, where we know that children they come into school oftentimes behind, and that gap accelerates, particularly without strong access to, as I call, year-round programs, or whole year, whole child activities. So a little more insight there. Again, that's an area that we're starting to focus on out in the field, is in these grades, pre-K to grades 3, where we'd like to be able to put our most talented teachers out there. We don't want to have more of them throughout all of our grades. But if we have a limited pool, then how do we get them in? How do we concentrate them in those early grades? Again, I talked about the importance of aiming not just for equally effective, but actually our best teachers. And how do we ensure that we can move our best teachers into these areas where they're able to impact and to serve our most disadvantaged children. But again, I want to underscore that the differences are very real, and they're differences that we have known for some time. And I think we're real appreciative that now we have some solid data by which we can be very thoughtful of. Which gets me to the study on the incentives. Again, one of the things we've been struggling with is to the extent that we can identify our most effective teachers, how do we get them to the schools that service the greatest disadvantaged children? And it was nice that this study was going on. We certainly participated in it to be able to see what would it take. Would monetary incentives work? And I think clearly what we've seen by the research here is that monetary incentives do work, although they raise a lot of questions. In other words, for us, what's the long sustainability and scalability of these? A lot of back and forth research about the impact of class size reduction. So it's nice to now have some additional research which shows that class size reduction isn't always the best answer or the most effective solution. It is one area to look at, and perhaps in combination with other incentives. That there are certainly trade-offs. The question about scale and sustainability is a very real one, and I think we've seen a positive effect that effective teachers will stay. But from my perspective, I get concerned when I see numbers, starting to drop off. I mean, 50%, 60%, still important, but given how long it takes to close those achievement gaps and to positively impact disadvantaged students who have been disadvantaged and who have been behind for so long, 2 or 3 years really concerns me. So how do we really focus on ensuring that our most effective teachers, again, once we've been able to identify them, actually stay in these schools at greater retention rates? And when I think about scale and sustainability, I think about, again, from my own context, we have 22 schools that are 100% poverty. I'm concerned with the ability to have a cadre of teachers that can move to our schools. And so it also begs the question of how do we, what kinds of strategic investments are we making in professional learning, particularly now with the Common Core? How do we, in essence, grow our own talent pool of teachers, particularly when, in my view, we're not necessarily getting the talent out of our teaching colleges, which is a whole separate topic, I'm sure, for more research. And that has been talked about. But I think it also raises questions of, will teachers go, and is it strictly for the dollars, or are there other incentives? And those of us out in the field, and certainly in Sacramento, we've been looking at additional incentives. And one of the things that we have seen that perhaps teamed with something like this is teachers want to be part of winning teams. And they typically like to go in groups. And they like to have and will work for very strong, supportive principals. Again, all being part of a winning team. And teachers will stay, even though they are working harder and they're working longer hours and they're going above and beyond, typically above and beyond the requirements that are in their collective bargaining agreements. These are things that we have seen. So how can those be combined, perhaps with some financial incentives to take a look at moving them along in groups? The other thing, again, I want to point out is this is getting some qualitative data, because oftentimes it's not how effective they are when they're in the classroom, but it's oftentimes what's inside their their heart when it comes to working with disadvantaged children. Perhaps some of the data that we saw in terms of the number that were eligible, those that actually interviewed while positions were filled, it certainly raises the questions about can we get some insights into that qualitative area, because it's a much different challenge working with disadvantaged children as it is non. And certainly concerns that we see is that want to go. Financial incentives in and of themselves aren't enough. So therefore, I get back to the questions of really looking at the group dynamic, and also looking at the leadership pieces. And I think ultimately freeing up teachers, right? So giving them the freedoms and the flexibilities to, in many ways, to teach to the kind of craft and profession that got them into it. These are other important considerations. And finally, I'd like to also talk a little bit about the importance of hiring. And one of the things that we have learned, and I think this study highlights, is that how teachers get hired really matters, and that a lot of traditional practices, which leave hiring up to teacher contracts, giving that whole ability to select or to be moved into schools, without having that input, without having that selection factor, also have important ramifications that I think we should take a look at. And these two studies shed some light on to those practices that I think we have known, but that there's such great variability amongst districts and even amongst schools that I think school districts would be really wise to spend some time looking at their hiring practices, as well as the ability of our principals to really hire and strategically build a team. These are also key implications and questions that get raised from the work. Now pass to Andrew.
We have an abundance of technology here. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always last. It's hard to go last on a panel like this, and you've had so much content. I could take the highbrow or the lowbrow in terms of an opening joke. The lowbrow would be like Elizabeth Taylor's wedding night on the last marriage. I don't know what I can add here that's original. Or given the weather, I could take the highbrow route and go with Shakespeare. We happy few who made it out here today in this weather. So I'll go with highbrow and borrow something else from Shakespeare, which is he famously said, brevity is the soul of wit. And so I hope in a few minutes you think I'm very witty. And we can leave a lot of time for discussion, as we say in the town. For a visitor's matter time, hopefully I can yield back some of my time. Jonathan said, these studies, they go hand in glove. And so it's a terrific pairing, and we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about them sort of comprehensively, not one after the other. But I also just want to acknowledge up front, they showcase just how creative Mathematica is about designing studies and about the kind of work they take on. And Mathematica has really pushed the boundaries, I think, of experimental design in education, what we can learn from that. And, when I first got into this business, you heard a lot of talk, and it wasn't, that many years ago, almost 2 decades ago, which isn't that long, about how we could never answer these questions, RCTs, it just wasn't applicable. This isn't medicine. You can't do this. And so we were doomed to fight these things out on people's hunches and guts and everything else. And there's been a big change in that, and a lot of people bear a lot of credit for that. But I just want to point out, I think Mathematica deserves a lot of credit when you look, and it's not just the two we're talking about here, a lot of different things. They've shown how you can actually do various kinds of experimental trials, and as Jonathan said, actually get evidence on these problems, not just intuition. But I think these studies do confirm things that we know intuitively. People respond to incentives. Incentives matter. We have this crazy conversation about education as if somehow incentives and basic rules of human behavior, economics, and everything else somehow stop at the schoolhouse door. And of course they don't. And we also know that low-income students get the short end of the stick in a lot of ways. That's part of what we do at Bellwether. Is work on those issues, and shedding empirical light on this is very helpful. And I guess I did skip, so just quickly for people maybe online. So I am a team right now, 35 professionals. We do work on 3 areas. We do talent, executive search, recruiting, helping organizations get better in terms of their internal talent issues. We do strategic advising, what you think of as traditional strategic advising, so financial modeling, growth plans, strategic plans, all of that kind of stuff. And then we do a lot of policy analysis and research, and that's the part of the organization that I lead. I should have said that up front. That's a little bit of a tangent, but just so for people, it's always good, where you stand often depends on where you sit, and that's where I sit in this sector. So the policy implications, I think, are very straightforward at a high level, and they're very complicated in practice. We should be trying to design incentives to reward teachers for teaching in more challenging environments, and we should be trying to figure out ways to address these inequities. One of the things I think was really noteworthy about the transfer experiment was the size of the incentive, the size of the money was significant. $20,000 is a lot of money for most people. And a lot of what's been tried previously here has been really weak incentives in terms of the amount of money. I'll give sort of an extreme example. I was helping a suburban school district right in this area. They wanted to design things to have master teachers mentor newer teachers. And you do this over the course of the year. This would be a deep mentoring relationship. And for the time you put in, which would be presumably significant to make this meaningful, you would be paid over the course of the year a differential of $200. So it was like that scene from Austin Powers. And I had to sort of gently point out to them that $200, there's lobbyists right now having a lunch downtown that costs more than that. And they do that every day. And if you want people to actually take something seriously, one of the ways we signal that is with money. And also people alter their behavior. Money, above a certain point for professionals, it stops mattering, but money does change. It changes your behavior, it changes your incentives. And so these weak things have not produced much results. People generally respond. And so studies like this where you actually do something that's meaningful and seeing behavioral consequences are very important. Second, this idea of the magnitude of effects. Look, we are not shifting the curve in incredible ways, but these matter. And I feel that every time one of these studies comes out, the first thing people do is they point to, well, it's small, it's insignificant. And there's sort of 2 counters to that. One, we're probably going to solve this problem through lots of relatively small effects that add up as we do different pieces right. And second, just what we saw today in terms of the student outcome and trajectory, those matter, particularly some of the districts where we're seeing greater variance. And I think it's irresponsible to sort of, and we have this political debate, which I'll talk about in a second, to discount these things. One of the key questions we're asked to talk about is sort of how we should think about incentives differently, and Jonathan got a little bit of groups. We don't know how to do this. I think we have some ideas and things we need to try and learn from. But so, should we try this with groups of teachers? I think absolutely we should try this with groups of teachers. We should try a bunch of different models.
The basic policy right now, though, presupposes that there are not important differences among teachers and among schools. We pay teachers based on overwhelmingly on two things, years of experience and degrees. And so if you're here in Washington, we've had this raging debate about impact and evaluation. It's important, but it's also very atypical if you look at the system nationwide across the country in terms of what the experience the average student's having that the average teachers have. And doing that is a choice, a negative policy choice, because we're saying we're going to ignore all these things, or we're going to do nothing. And the evidence of the adverse effects is actually very clear. We saw it today. There's numerous studies that show during teachers' careers how they migrate and so forth. We don't yet know all the positive incentives, but the only way to get there is to try different things. Tying those incentives to performance as much as possible will make them more effective. Right now, that's happening implicitly. So, for example, in Washington, D.C., just a few years ago, but we need to make those linkages more explicit as we do this. It's complicated, obviously, but there's an enormous lack of transparency. And I think if you look across the policy changes we've seen with all the changes to evaluation, the laws that states have passed in the last few years, well, the big thing that jumps out at you is in how many places those changes are not actually consequential. So teachers are getting evaluated, they're putting in new things, but that data, in very few states, prohibit a kid from being assigned to ineffective teachers for consecutive years. Very little transparency as far as parents' right to know about these things, how that's that information is being made public, and not in a sort of just dumping value-added scores in the newspaper, but in a responsible way. What rights the parents have to actually know about qualifications, things like that. And so there's a huge lack of transparency now, and to make these things work, we need to attack that. You'll hear pushback that working conditions matter, and that is absolutely correct. And I think it's easy in the policy community to sort of discount working conditions, because people sort of take their own working conditions, which tend to be pretty good, for granted. It's a big issue. There's evidence from survey research, focus groups. I did a focus group project in the Upper Midwest years ago with talking to teachers about why we went to teachers in edge cities and asked if they can move into the urban core and teach in challenging schools. They're not going to go if they don't feel safe. They're not going to go if those schools aren't well led. They don't like to actually go alone. And you see that from different things. They don't want to be parachuted in there. And you see that from the national board teachers. And you see that with Teach for America teachers, this idea to just parachute people in. They like a cohort. And they want other basic things that, frankly, professionals want. And so we need to be attentive to this issue of working conditions, but we can't allow that conversation to trump these other things. And often the conversation goes like this: well, we have evidence that if we created incentives to get higher performing teachers into these schools, we would see an impact on student achievement. Well, yes, but it's about working conditions. Well, it's both. And we shouldn't weaponize these things, and it's both. It's a valid point that needs to be taken in context. And I think that points to the problem here that I just want to put on the table, which is politics. We have a phenomenally unhealthy conversation about teachers in this country. If you step back, we infantilize them. You hear frequently a pushback on differentiation. You hear teachers aren't going to be able to work in an environment where you're differentiating based on performance. That's just they won't be collaborative. They won't be effective. They can't handle it. And you hear that from avowed defenders and proponents of teaching are the ones saying this. It infantilizes teachers. Teachers, like other professionals, can handle differentiation. There is differentiation in most workplaces. I'm quite sure there's differentiation in Mathematica among what people earn, levels of responsibility, different things. And professionals can handle this. We are reluctant to make differentiation in education, and we pay an enormous price for that. But that's sort of what's behind this push we hear on class size, and not saying, well, what Jonathan said is, why don't we reduce class size? And you see schools doing this very effectively in the early grades, and then you can grow class size in later grades, so you figure out where you're getting your bang for your buck, and instead we spread it. It's always peanut butter, because making these differentiations are challenging. And people just don't want to talk candidly about this. So I'll just put that on the table. You risk being labeled a teacher basher. As soon as you start talking about things that the data show and aggregate about teacher effectiveness and so forth, you're quickly into just a very sort of unpleasant neighborhood in our sector, and people tend to shy away from that. We have to be able to talk about these things candidly, look at the evidence, and it's not incompatible with valuing and respecting teachers to also say we have a set of issues that the field simply has to figure out how to address if we're going to move forward. And And then the last point is sort of culture, and I forget who said, it may have been Stephen said, we don't, or Jonathan, maybe Stephen said, the glory is not always in teaching high achievers, and that is so true. Teaching low achievers. The glory in schools, the culture is teaching high achievers, teaching the AP teachers. You look at the Washington Post has had a guy writing for years. He teaches AP, teaches advanced classes. They've never gone to find someone to write columns who's teaching the most challenging kids in the city, or in Alexandria, or in Fairfax. The glory goes to teaching the kids. It's challenging to teach those kids, but it's a different kind of challenge. And if you look at most institutions in American life, and I'm talking everything from the private sector, the military, professional sports, the glory is in the hardest and the most challenging things. That's what's respected, and not even just from a fiscal standpoint. It's not always about money. It's just about prestige, respect, and stuff. And who does the most challenging, the difficult things? That's where the glory lies. Our culture is backwards, and part of getting the policy right is to also change the culture, and incentives and so forth can start to send a signal that this is what we value. So in terms of future directions, and then I'll open it up. I want to open it up for questions. I'm excited to hear your questions. I think we're still learning about some of the combinations here, and the thing that interests me the most, and we still have relatively little evidence on, is what happens when you put highly effective teachers in highly effective environments? What's then the compounding effect? And we have schools that we know are more effective than other schools in the traditional public sector and the charter sector. There's a varying performance. We can identify higher performing schools. So what happens if you take teachers who are highly effective and you put them in these environments? Do we see a compounding effect or not? Either way, there's pretty big implications. And that gets back to this issue of impact size. How do you start to piece things together and start to get the kind of impact changes that we want to see? And then second, this question of fit, and what makes teachers effective in different environments. We still approach this in a very sort of binary way: good teacher, bad teacher. And in fact, it's good teacher in certain environments, bad teacher in other environments. There are people who clearly aren't cut out for the job, and we don't do a good enough job sort of separating them from the profession. But you do have a situation where you have teachers who may not be excelling in one environment, but they would do well in a different environment. You see that a lot at the sort of personal anecdotal level, and I think there's some stories you can see. There's some stories there. And any job is about fit. We all know, I'm sure, people who struggled in one environment, but it doesn't mean they're not a competent professional. You put them in a different environment, they excel. Teachers are no different. This is a profession, and we need to do a lot more to learn about fit and start really thinking about what are the characteristics of teachers who excel with different kinds of kids. How do you create incentives? How do we think about placement, hiring, and those things? And we're still having this very, very binary, good, bad, hired, not hired, this kind of conversation. And if to really both create a profession and to really provide the kind of the level of customization performance that we want to see for kids, we have to get into these sort of things that are one level down from this: are you a good teacher or not? So with that, look forward to your questions and conversation. Again, thank you for having me.
Wow, that was just a wealth of commentary from our discussions tonight. I have to pause for a moment just to thank you and get the question and answer session started off. There's so much there to work with, but I hope that all the questions, or at least some of the questions, will push them a little bit further about so how do we make some of the policy things happen that they were talking about. So let me open it up to both the audience in-house and the webinar participants, and we'll sort of go back and forth. Do we have questions? Start with in-house.
So this is a question for Steve.
And can you identify yourself? And
I'm sorry. This is Sheena McConnell, Mathematica Policy Research. Steve, this is a question for you. So did you find any difference in attrition from the non-transfer teachers in the treatment and the control schools? I could imagine that if you're already teaching in a disadvantaged school and somebody else arrives and gets an extra $10,000 for doing the same job as you've already been doing and not being paid extra, so that might have an effect.
So the short answer is no. The figure that I showed before that had these sort of survival curves of teachers with the TTI and the control. Those were the ones who filled the vacancies. When you look at the other teachers in the same grade, their peers, and again, that's treatment versus control, those two lines were in between the others and sort of overlapping each other, so no difference.
Carmen? This question comes from our webinar audience. It's not directed at anyone specifically, but I think it's focused on for Steve and Eric. Did either study find evidence that teacher value added is correlated with the type of student? So, i.e., some teachers may be more effective with boys or girls or with English language learners as opposed to native speakers?
We did not look at that particular question.
So we thought about this. I mean, that was one of the hypotheses was precisely what Andy was talking about, which is that, well, what if teachers' value added isn't a constant, value added? They might be better with some kinds of teachers, with some kind of students rather, and not with others. And I think others have also raised this hypothesis. The problem is that from an empirical perspective, unless you have teachers working with all different kinds of students, it's hard to know how they are. Now, one of the things that we, might look at, and there's going to be opportunities to sort of analyze the data from this study, is to drill down a little bit deeper and figure out, because we have this, randomization that resulted in transfers as opposed to sort of purely self-selected transfers, to sort of observe teachers in different settings, to look at their effectiveness in those different settings. I mean, the first order answer would be, well, we had a group of teachers who were effective and deemed effective in one setting, and then found to be effective in very different settings. We described just how different those settings are in the report. What we were not able to do, probably for the same reason as Eric, is come up with these really fancy measures so we could say for a given teacher, your ability to teach ESL kids is this, and your ability to teach disadvantaged kids is this, and have a whole array of, because those estimates would be wildly imprecise for any individual teacher.
Let me just add to answer that. So we didn't look at that in the first report, but in the follow-up brief we're doing now, we are looking at teacher mobility. And we're looking at teachers who switch schools. So we're not looking at, for particular types of kids, particular types of teachers, but we're going to answer the general question, when teachers move from one school to another, does their value added stay the same? Does it go down? Does it go up? Which may be suggestive of whether there is something to match quality, which is something that our discussants are bringing up, that certain teachers do better in certain environments. Well, this will give maybe some sense of whether that is showing up in the value-added data.
So let me bring in our discussants a little bit, because really what I think you're talking about here is how much information content really is there in these value-added measures, and I think part of what I'm going to ask the discussants is, how credible did you find this evidence that you're getting information about value-added measures actually differentiating teachers? And then the other question, I guess, is, are we getting a little bit of information about the portability of that value added? So part of what I think Steve's pointing out is that these teachers not only were effective in one setting as measured by the value added, but then they had impacts in these new settings. And so part of this is, well, how credible do you find that, and how useful is that in how you might use that for policy and practice?
Let me take a crack first. And having the data is really important because it shows, and Andrew touched a lot upon this, is that we need to be much more strategic. And this notion of one size fits all has to be so far gone in the way we approach educating children. They don't come to school ready to learn at the same rates. They have varied backgrounds. The challenges are enormous, and who's teaching whom is really important. And so to the extent that we have data, and I think the question that came in, it's true. There are some teachers that are more effective with certain groups of students. And so, we need information, we need data. It shouldn't be the only source of information that we use when we're making these important decisions, but we do need to be very thoughtful and very strategic and very transparent about that information. Children have a right to know, parents have a right to know, and how we assign our teachers, where we put those teachers, what they're coming to us with, what kinds of training and background and skills, and are we able to track their impact and their effectiveness at a very, very early time, is also important for tenure and other considerations. So this is really, really important information. But I want to underscore that it isn't the only information, and we shouldn't be basing all of our decisions just upon this source of data, because it is an imperfect source, as helpful as it is for us right now.
So I guess for the first part of the question, I think what Jonathan said, I agree, and I think what's exciting about Stephen's study is this idea that the transfer, it not only incentivizes behavior, incentivizes things that you would want to see in terms of outcomes, and so the portability, that's exciting, and that's a thread we need to tug on. In terms of the value-added question more generally, I mean, this is one of these conversations. I get asked all the time, so find out you work in education, what do you think about value-added? It's like asking people, what do you think about chainsaws? Well, like in some situations, they're a very handy tool, and people use them to earn their living, and they're very useful. In other situations, they're extremely dangerous, and people shouldn't have them. And value add, it's a tool, and you want to think about how you're going to use it. And I think how you use it in research and trying to figure things out is going to be different, and how you use it in the aggregate is going to be different than how you use it in an evaluative context. When you're talking about high-stakes consequences for individuals. Some of the same issues that we go round and round with in terms of testing tells you really valuable things. As soon as you start to aggregate that data, you want to be pretty careful in terms of how you think about using that for individual students and decisions about them. But our political conversation about this doesn't have right now the tensile strength to have that conversation. It's very sort of, are you for or against value added, which really is like asking, are you for or against chainsaws? And so I think in what we're seeing here, there's enormous value in using it, no pun intended, in using it to sort of, you can draw real inferences among patterns we're seeing, things like that. How you use it in the evaluative context is, again, it is more complicated, although I do think it has value there, and there's become a tendency in the political community to sort of talk it down to a level that's sort of ignorant about what we actually know about it, predictive value, how it works, and so forth. It's become a talking point rather than an empirical point.
Okay. Questions?
Matt Stegner, Mathematica Policy Research. I was intrigued by the talk about both the context teachers are moving into, but even more importantly, the team notion. And I wondered if our discussants had thoughts about how would you actually organize a set of incentives that were at a team level, and how could you, in the next round of learning more about this, actually try not to do this on an individual level, but think more about both the work context, but also the team that a teacher might be related to.
We have 7 schools in Sacramento. They're called superintendent priority schools, and we've taken that exact approach. We weren't able to pay teachers different because of our contract situation, but we were able to move them in as teams. And so what we did with these first 6, and then we added a school, is they were all our lowest performing schools by all measures. In 6 of the 7, we removed the principal. We brought in a new principal that had been at a previous school within the district and had shown great results at that school in terms of academic performance, climate, culture. And we brought them in and freed them up. They could build their own team. And they then went about looking at the faculty and staff that was in that school environment, doing both qualitative and quantitative analysis. And then ultimately they got to build a team. And in some cases that meant bringing teachers 20%, 30%, 70% of those schools turned over. And teachers came in. Largely they came in teams. And one of the incentives that they had was they were going to be valued as professionals. They were going to receive and provided for extra time for collaboration, extra time for staff development and staff training, and that these were places that and Andrew put a real light on this, is that we were going to be educating to the whole child. So we were going to be looking at the social emotional needs of these children. We were going to be looking, we did some small things like we deep cleaned all of these schools. We painted all these schools. We landscaped them. We brought them up to code. And I use one example of, what does it say to a child, when there's a piece of graffiti on the wall that's been there, for months and months, and every day children and adults walk by that. So, it places that where we spend a lot of time with climate and culture and the working conditions. And by and large, what we've seen, and teachers are working incredibly hard at these schools, that they want to be there because, they're seeing results, right? So they're seeing the outcomes. It's very clear that in exchange for these freedoms and flexibilities and extra supports and resources, that they will stay. We also did one other important thing, is that we protected these teachers. We protected these teams. And so we found a way to get around, or to legally, seniority-based layoffs at these turnaround schools. And so all that work of building this collective efficacy and these teams, and the incentives to want to be great, right? And that way we protected them so that within a year they wouldn't be dispersed or they wouldn't be laid off. And I think that those incentives, and I think coupled with some other ones, and I really like this idea of getting at differentiation, because I say it all the time: equity is not equal. Disadvantaged children need more, and in my view, those that are teaching and working with our disadvantaged children, they need more too. And in some cases, that also is compensation. They need more time to work together. They need more time to plan together. They need more time for professional learning. They need more resources for their classrooms, and they should perhaps be compensated more.
I think that's all y'all said. I would just, two things to put a fine point on that. It's a very good question. One is, just going back to what Jonathan said at the top, you have to sort of translate that. He's like, well, we couldn't do differentiation because of the contract. Like, translation in pure English, I'm a manager, but I can't actually manage my people. I'm not allowed to create incentives and so forth for them. We're never going to solve this problem as long as we have conversations like that, and it's sort of just taken as a given. Well, of course, you can't have control over your sort of personnel and ways to create incentives for them where you want them. It's just, that's how broken the system is, and we talk about it in these sort of veiled things. I don't think it puts the fine point on just the struggle to actually manage this system in an effective way. Second, just a direct response to your question, I think you want to decouple these things. I think when you start getting into, and we've seen some experience with these big school-based group bonuses, you introduce a lot of politics, you introduce a lot of gamesmanship and other things. Those individual incentives can work. But they're not you can decouple them. We don't want to be reductionist, and that's not at odds with the team approach. You can say, and we do a very bad job in this field of talking about monetary and non-monetary incentives. So you can say there's going to be a financial incentive if you do this. We're also going to do these things. You'll be part of a team. You're going to get additional support. Here's what we're going to do. John, here's what we're going to do at these schools to create a better set of conditions. And you can decouple those things to where the incentive for the individual to be part of that is individual, but they're also seeing all these other things that go hand in hand with it. You want to be. We make these policies often more reductionist than they have to be.
So can I push that a little bit, because even if you have the will to differentiate pay, I'm kind of wondering where the money comes from, because at least my understanding in D.C. with the impact evaluation is that money is coming from private sources, but that's not a solution for the whole country. So I wondered if there were any ideas on that front.
Well, actually, I think in D.C. we should be careful to delineate what they bought. What they bought with that money was politics. They said, we want to do this thing. It's very avant-garde. It's going to be, as we saw, it's going to be politically contentious. It was a years and years battle. Worth noting, when the battle was over, the teachers voted for it overwhelmingly when it was actually put to a vote. And so that money basically bought politics and time. I think the answer to your question is the current system has cost. Steps and lanes is not somehow a system without cost and a free system. What we essentially do, we move up and we backload you very heavily in your last few years, particularly when you then factor in deferred compensation, retirement, and things like that. And so the money is there. The money is just, it's misaligned from what we know about lots of things, including effectiveness. And so there has to be a conversation of, if you want to tackle this problem, how do you think about reallocating resources? Look, I'm all for more resources, particularly, Jonathan, at a place like California, where, the schools have just been starved. And I think people, because there's so much, people always say,
people are they're nearer to hearing school systems ask for more money because they always ask for more money, and so you have it's a little bit the boy who cried wolf. And so when you have a situation in California, a lot of people roll their eyes and like, well, they're just asking for more. But California's actually cut whatever metaphor you want to use. They've cut to the muscle, to the bone, whatever. And those cuts are having real impacts on kids the way they're running schools there. So I'll be the first one to say we need to invest more. We also can take a look at we talk about this as if all the money in the system is being efficiently spent, as if it's being spent in ways that are aligned with what we know about the evidence, and it's not. And so there is, if you want to offer bonuses like this, there are ways to actually do that in a fiscally neutral way.
And for those not here in the audience, just note that I'm agreeing and nodding my head. So it's absolutely, Andrew is right on.
Except with the parts that get him in political trouble, then he vehemently disagrees with those points.
I do. This question is for Steve Glazerman. Do you look to see if there is an effect of transfers on the sending schools to ensure they didn't suffer from losing highly effective teachers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been feeling this one a lot. It's a very natural question to ask, right? Because what the policy does is it doesn't sort of create new teachers out of thin air. It finds them in one place and provides them incentive to transfer somewhere else. So the question is, are you just moving people around and, on net not being any better off? So we actually did not, with the resources we have in the study, we really focused on the receiving schools with the understanding that the sending schools, they lose a teacher. Now, what we did is we measured how much, what percentage of sending schools were affected by losing a teacher, and how many. It was, I think, 10% of the potential sending schools actually lost a teacher. But the operating assumption of the intervention was that you have schools that are hard to staff and schools that are not so hard to staff, and for all of those, desirable positions, teaching. Higher achieving students, there's probably a line of other teachers ready to take their place, and so they'd have an easier time of filling that position with a strong teacher. But we didn't measure it explicitly, and it's left as an unknown. It's an important important qualification that when we talk about cost effectiveness, we're talking about from the perspective of the receiving schools, and that's it comes down to it's really a policy question of, do you want to favor disadvantaged students? And I think we've heard some of the discussion here suggesting that if we want to close achievement gaps, then that might be necessary, even if there is an unmeasurable but possibly negative effect on sending schools.
And there's also an implication here. We hear about teacher shortage, but actually this country on an annual basis produces more teachers than there are jobs. We just don't produce them in the right geographies and the right subjects on the right grades. So we have, for example, a lot of states produce an abundance of elementary school teachers and they can't find work. And so in terms of these issues of incentives and signaling, there's obviously clear policy implications there in terms of, so the idea that the contextual piece here is it's not as if these sending schools are necessarily inherently being put at a deficit. There are even accounting for the difference between some schools have more applicants per position than others. Just generally, we have a supply of teachers. We're just not signaling to them well, so they're in the wrong places, the wrong subjects, and so forth. And again, financial incentives are one way you can signal to people and influence their behavior.
And I want to add a follow-up research is so what makes these teachers effective, and what are their teaching practices, and what impacts are they having? How are they getting these impacts? So we can, as we further break it down, and as we start to really address how do we teach these skills, how do we develop them, and then certainly how do we push them down into our teaching preparation institutions and schools? That's going to be really important for us to get our arms around.
Any questions in the room?
I feel like it's important we don't end this on a down note. I mean, I will say, I've been at this for about 2 decades. About 15 years ago, we put out a paper against the Policy Institute on differential pay. Pretty tepid stuff, just that we should start thinking about differentiating based on how challenging the assignment is, shortage areas, so we struggle to find special ed teachers, struggle to find math, some teaching the hard sciences, languages, things like that, and all hell broke loose with that. And I mean, it was an enormous issue. And that paper, it wouldn't occasion a write-up in Ed Week now. It would be a big nothing. And so the conversation we're having, we have made a lot of progress, and the fact that we're talking increasingly not about whether you should do this, but how and what's going to be effective and what good policy design looks like. There's been just an enormous amount of progress, and it really does, in terms of, as you think about American social policy, a relatively short period of time.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just address one of the points that's been raised a couple of times now, and also came up in Matt's question, which is this idea of moving cadres of teachers, teams, winning teams. And it's worthwhile, I think, pointing out some backstory to the development of what became the Talent Transfer Initiative, because this idea came up a lot. And I think where we were is that, we didn't, when you think about the mechanics of actually implementing that policy, you have to be ready to displace a lot of staff at a school. You have to be ready. It's a school transformation, as Jonathan described, or it's sometimes called reconstitution, or there's other terms. But it's a fairly major change, and it can be very expensive too. It's sort of what you do when you're at at rock bottom. And it's been tried. It's been done in Charlotte-Mecklenburg and Chattanooga, and I'm sure several other places. We just heard a description of how they're doing this in Sacramento. But it's potentially much more expensive and risky. And so as a research enterprise, the goal was let's first try this. Let's first just see what happens when you move one teacher, or maybe two. There were several schools that had more than one teacher, but that wasn't the norm. Transfer TTI teacher. And so actually where we are then is, we've done that first step. And so, because when you talk about embedding it within a randomized experiment or some kind of rigorous study, that requires a certain amount of investment, and you only want to do that when you're at that level of scrutiny that you think, all right, now we have an expensive intervention. Is it worth testing it? We've done sort of that first step. It might be worth thinking about whether that is the next idea to test, something more drastic. And the question might be, well, is moving a group of teachers or moving a principal and letting that principal recruit a team of teachers, and let's say you have to attach incentives to that as well, or differentiated pay, are the benefits from that greater than the sum of the benefits of moving individual teachers at a time? You'll have the same issues that we have with this one, which is scaling. But it's maybe it's worth maybe that's where we are. Maybe that's worth thinking about next.
Yeah, from my perspective, what I've learned and what I've taken, again, these are some things that we've known on our own, right? That access is real. But now now we have data that access is real across multiple school districts, across multiple states, looking in very different demographic areas. I mean, it's real, and that also incentives are meaningful, and incentives can work. So for practitioners, this is really, really important information that we have. And I think what it means from a policy standpoint, as I step back, is we've got to create in the policy structures more incentives for collaboration, more incentives to work together, more incentives to take a look at what hasn't worked, and really make some transformative changes. And I think when you couple this with the recent PISA results, it should be this incredible wake-up call, both for policy and practitioners, that what we've been doing, largely hasn't been effective. It hasn't been working. And so it's time to be bold, and it's time to do some really, really radical things if we want a better outcome, right? If we want a better outcome. And I think we have to ask ourselves that question too.
Good. I have another webinar question for Steve Glazerman. Were there any patterns that emerged around which candidates applied and did not apply for the transfers? I'm wondering if there are implications for districts or states in doing targeted recruitment. Great question.
Yeah, well, this is a good question. If I understand it, it was who did and didn't apply among the candidates? Yeah. So we actually did a couple things. One thing we did was we just asked on a survey, if you didn't apply, why not? Or if you didn't transfer, why not? And unfortunately, what people will tell you is, well, I was happy at my old school. So we sort of get a mix of somewhat expected answers. I mean, we gave about 20 some odd possible reasons, and just about everyone got mentioned by somebody. And then it included commuting time, and it included, we asked, was the bonus not big enough? And there were a fraction, I don't know, probably about a quarter who said, yeah, that was a factor. But then we also just looked at the characteristics of those teachers who did and didn't transfer, and tried to see, can we predict, who would and who wouldn't. And it turned out to be somewhat difficult. It's, by using sort of observable characteristics of teachers that we could measure through surveys, we sort of looking it up, but we found that there were some factors that are associated with greater probability of applying, greater probability of transferring, where they didn't always go in a predicted direction. Those who were more satisfied with their salary, for example, were more likely to transfer. Those who were more satisfied with their students were more likely to transfer. There's some demographic characteristics. People who are married and living with children under 5 were more likely to transfer. And there were some differences in terms of race, ethnicity of the teachers. But these didn't really come together in any kind of compelling story. I think it's important to note that while the intervention was designed so that there was really one criterion, and one criterion only, which was value added. And I want to point out, that's not a value judgment that we think that's how you should identify high-performing teachers. That was actually a conscious decision to sort of make the test a cleaner one. But there's another component, which is just this unobserved taste and teachers knowing, whether they would, their own assessment about whether they would be effective in their new schools, and the principal's selection, because the principal had to make an offer, it was mutual consent. So these sort of self-selection factors combined with the value added, produced a group that, despite, with the exception of those characteristics I mentioned a minute ago, didn't look that different from the ones who, those who transferred from those who didn't, or those who applied from those who didn't. We looked at whether the highest of the high value added teachers were more likely to apply, and we didn't find a significant difference there. If you're interested in sort of understanding it more deeply, you can look through our quantitative results, but there really isn't a story that emerged that we can sort of point to and say this is the theory of why, what explains, so you could actually form a targeting, do a targeting policy. Perhaps the best targeting policy is to let people select themselves. At least that's the way this intervention was designed. That might help solve some of the match issues that Andy was talking about. If they're very complicated and too hard for us to estimate, as researchers sitting at a desk with a bunch of data, maybe we should let teachers and principals meet each other and talk, and decide on a basis that's more personal and connected to the particular context and situations.
Before we run out of time, I do have one question that I was sort of curious about, and that is that the analyses that Eric's report does are pretty complicated, and I guess I've been struggling with what would districts do with these types of analyses. And then Jonathan, in his comments, said this is really useful information, and this is great that we finally have some evidence that's quantitative. And I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate a little bit on that, because some of it is, well, what should be expected of districts to do for themselves to really give them more concrete evidence of what's going on with the distribution of effective teachers. Or maybe you've already been doing that at this kind of a level, and not to put you on the spot.
No, the ramifications from our standpoint, and I talked about this a little bit, is that, in some ways, from prior agreements that other administrations have made, in Sacramento, how we hire teachers, how they get placed, that gets tied up, right? So it isn't like we have complete freedom and flexibility. Now, again, that may be a Sacramento issue that's different from Fresno, that's different from San Francisco, or that's different from Broward County. But those things really matter. So I think what's helpful for us, though, is to the extent that we have information, that we have data that's more than our own empirical data, right? And things that we have gathered, but also evidence that goes beyond, that involves multiple school districts across multiple states. That's important information for us to have to start making some of these changes, and changes that have a meaningful impact for kids. So, armed with this in information, it gives us a basis by which to make changes not only at the policy level but at the real level, which is how do we change our hiring practices? How do we change the way we are sourcing our teachers? And how do we even look at how we're compensating our teachers? These are very real pieces for us, and it's easier to make them when you have data. And as I think we've been talking about, the importance of value added is it's another data tool for us to utilize in making decisions. And I would say that making decisions, in terms of placements and assignments, are very different than from a professional development and from an evaluation standpoint. And we shouldn't confuse the two. But that we need, this field, right? And we're as I think was said, we're a large urban district in California. When you think about the 14,000 school districts across the country that don't have access to this information, they don't have the analytical tools, they don't have the research tools. Suddenly, having this kind of information available is really, really important, and can help drive change, which has to occur at multiple levels.
Part of what you were bringing up there at the end was, I guess I'm kind of curious about how much analytic capability there are, that districts do have, and how can policy facilitate, or what really needs to happen to provide this type of information more on a larger scale? Because some of the districts that participate in the study, of course, we're giving them some of this information to try and facilitate and help them as a result of participating in the study. But is this something that states can do, or do you have other suggestions? That's part of what
I was in a larger school district before I came out to Sacramento, one that has a fairly robust research and evaluation shop in Charlotte. Very different when I got to Sacramento. I mean, it was a very a much smaller, with a different skill level, and again, we're one of the larger districts in California. And when you start to talk about the other, 990 just in California alone, I mean, none of this capacity largely exists, except for maybe what may be somebody who had who did their graduate work. And while we have access in Sacramento to institutions, again, I think it's very limited. And I would say that the California Department of Education, again, very, very limited. And so as I look around the country, I would say that the vast majority of school districts do not have access to this kind of analytical research to do on their own. And so that's why I think this study by not only Mathematica but supported by the Department of Education is just absolutely critical, because we make certain assumptions that we have a lot of information. While we have a lot of data out in school districts, most of it sits on shelves without being able to be utilized, and most of it isn't even understandable to our most important constituents, which are our children and our parents, let alone our educators.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have any questions in the room. Otherwise, I'll give my panelists an opportunity to say any last words if they want to.
Actually, I wanted to take advantage of that last thing you just said, which I think was important. which is, it's worthwhile really using this opportunity to think about ways that school districts and state departments of education can partner with researchers to move policy. And I think what the federal government has been doing has been enormously effective in sort of running large-scale studies that help inform the field more generally. But then when you want to go to implement or go to find out, well, is my, what is the teacher effectiveness gap in my district? You need to, school districts are trying to educate kids, not necessarily do research, and especially smaller districts that can't sort of staff and maintain a whole army of analysts and statisticians and so on. So really, there are a lot of creative solutions out there. You have, people like the Strategic Data Project at Harvard embedding people in school districts. You have organizations like ours that are working with, district at a time in partnerships with districts and states in places like D.C. and Pittsburgh and Oklahoma. And, I think we need to just promote and increase more of these kinds of collaborations because, as Jonathan said, there's a lot of data sitting around there that needs to be sort of, liberated, right? We need to process these data and do the analytics to translate, all the information that gets generated and sort of left somewhere into actionable data. So we're the district that has the inequality problem. We need to design a policy to address that. Now, school districts often know, they have some intuition. What we need to do is take all the intuition and self-knowledge from practice and marry it with data analytics, because each of those is more powerful when they work together. I just want to mention that I was in a school district where we had sort of a crude version of the analysis that Eric and his team did, where we sort of listed districts based on very unequal to not so unequal. We gave them codes A through F or whatever, and asked districts, do you know which one you are? Which of these graphs describes your district? And some of them really nailed it, and others had a harder time and were surprised. And I think that's the kind of exchange we need more of, so that we can feel like what we're doing is actually helping somebody, and districts can feel like they have somebody that they can reach out to sort of use data to buttress what the directions that they want to head in and how to allocate resources.
Hey, Betsy. Ruth from the webinar wanted me to mention that school districts that want to conduct these analyses should contact their regional educational laboratories as well.
So there are opportunities. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating in the forum today. It's been a fantastic forum, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. Please be sure to let us know how you think we did, completing the comment card in your packets or the electronic survey offered to our webinar audience. And thank you all to our distinguished panelists. Thank you so much.